So every now and then a new coffee grinder, hand grinder, coffee, whatever, breaks through the noise and kind of rises to the surface as the new thing that everybody seems to be using. And usually there are two reasons why this can happen. And the first is because the new thing is actually just really great. Or maybe it's even just decently great and a lot less expensive than other things that are similarly great. And the second reason is a little bit less good, and that is because of hype. Not always from the manufacturers, although that does happen quite a bit, but sometimes even just a lot of people will buy a new product and they'll be really excited about it and they'll be sharing online about it, and before long it seems like this is kind of the thing. And in the case of the Mavo Phantox Pro, I think the answer is it's actually a little bit of both. Now, Mavo is a Chinese company, and you saw this grinder kind of rise to popularity in Asia first. And what you would see is people online comparing it to all kinds of grinders that were a lot more expensive. Grinders like the C40, the EasyPresso ZP6, the EasyPresso K Ultra, and saying, hey, it's kind of like this with a little bit of that. And all those grinders were way more expensive. And so you saw a lot of people piling on picking up this grinder. Eventually I started to get requests to review it on my channel here. And so I had reached out to Mavo and said, hey, would you consider sending me a unit? I'd love to review, getting a lot of requests from my audience. And they said, certainly. So they sent it over. They don't have any input or preview on this video, and I started messing with it. So before we get to any of those comparisons, I think we should just brew a coffee with it and explain how it works. The whole body is stainless steel. It's got this little silicone ring that goes around the outside. The handle, it's got a wood knob and this interesting bar shaped handle on here. And like basically any other hand grinder, you put your coffee in the top, set your adjustment size with this little ring right here, which is on the outside as opposed to the inside. A lot of people really like that. And then you start grinding. And in about 15 to 20 seconds, at least for 15 gram pour over, you're more or less done. The bottom screws off. It's not magnetic or anything like that. And then you can just dump your coffee into your pour over. Now, just while I'm brewing here, one little quirk, I did have a couple issues with this grinder. And one of them was with this adjustment ring up here. And you do get used to this, but just because of where it is and there's no real break between it and the body, if you're grinding, you're not paying attention, your hand can kind of slip up and slip around the adjustment ring. And if you're grinding it and that happens, you can actually accidentally adjust your grind setting or even your calibration in some cases. You do get used to it, but it is something you need to be aware of. Also, manufacturing standards is something that we're asking about, what they can tell us about their manufacturing standards for workers and environmental impact. And when we asked Mavo about this, they said these issues belong to the company's internal information and cannot be disclosed. They did assure us that their production processes are standardized and professional. Everything is certified, without really being able to give us any kind of clarity on what that actually meant. I think that's a position that a lot of companies are actually in, but I think for now I'll just leave that with you and let's see how this tastes. This is a washed Kenyan coffee from Hatch. That is a great cup of coffee. It's got good clarity, very evenly presented acidity. It actually reminds me a little bit in some ways of a Timemore 078 in that it presents the flavor profile in a bit of a unique way that's very forgiving overall. Tasty cup, not offensive at all. Very nice and good cup of coffee. Now, I am going to get to those comparisons like, hey, does it actually taste like this grinder or that grinder? But I want to show you a couple pretty interesting things first. When you take the burr out, which you need to do with a hex wrench, the first thing that you notice is that it's actually a pretty beefy burr. It's actually a 7-sided burr, and it's a lot bigger than what you would normally find in hand grinders this size. Normally a hand grinder like this would probably have a 38 millimeter burr in it. The diameter of the inner burr, this part is usually closer to 30 mil. This is a 45 millimeter burr, and the inner burr diameter is closer to like 37 mil. Now this burr looks like a lot of other burrs that you would commonly see until you look at the outer burr in here. And when you look in there, you'll see something really unusual. You'll see a bit of a crisscross pattern in the lower part, which actually finishes the grind particles. And normally you would see only kind of like one set of those grooves going one way. This is a bit of an unusual setup and I haven't seen it before. And you do see people saying things like, yeah, it gives you a lot of clarity like a ZP6, but it's a little bit more round and forgiving, kind of like a Comandante C40. So as a part of testing this grinder, I actually did a lot of side-by-sides with all those grinders. I did the C40, the K Ultra, which is EasyPress's flagship. I also did the ZP6, of course, and I can kind of see where people are coming from on that, but I also don't totally agree. I will say from a clarity standpoint, it is a little bit less clarity than a ZP6. It also is more clear than something like a C40, but it does bring a lot of that round, forgiving element that a C40 has to a more clear profile. But I will also say all of those grinders brought an intensity and a distinctiveness that I found this one didn't quite have in the same way. You know, the cups were great, inoffensive, very forgiving, round, clear without being obtrusive, but still not really with that same fullness in the cup that I would get from that more expensive tier of grinders. Now, all those grinders cost a lot more as well than the Phantox Pro. So, you know, of course, I'm not surprised that I'm going to enjoy the cups a little bit more, but also they're the grinders that it gets compared to when people are talking about this thing online, and part of the reason why it's been hyped so much at its price. Now, does that make it a bad grinder? No, it's a perfectly good grinder. Is it giving you everything that grinders twice as expensive are going to give you in the cup? I'm going to say no, and that's okay. I tested it against another grinder that is actually a lot closer to its price range, the Timemore S3. And that was very interesting. I did find that the Phantox had kind of a more well-rounded profile than the S3 in a way that had some softer edges on it and was maybe a little bit sweeter. I will say that the Timemore S3 and actually all the other grinders that I tested against the Phantox Pro feel like more mature products than this grinder. Let me explain. Number one, you need to use tools, as I mentioned, to get the burr out, get in there for a deep clean. I can get over that. However, when doing that, I actually almost broke this grinder entirely. It was pretty close. You see, on the end of the axle, there's this little square key that goes on the end, and you need to perfectly line that up with a very shallow square inlet in this locking plate here. So when you go to put it on, number one, it's kind of tricky to get on. So that doesn't feel super clean as it is. Then I'm kind of holding it in as I'm putting this hex bolt back in, and I'm going to screw it in. And one time I didn't have it quite perfectly lined up, so I got this tightened as much as I could go and calibrated the grinder. And then I'm using it and everything's going great. And then a couple of uses later, the handle starts spinning and it's clear that the burr is not actually turning anymore. And I'm like, okay, this is weird. What's happening here? So it kept happening, and eventually I took it apart and I saw that that square bit just kind of in the end was not totally seated and had actually started rounding off the inlet that it's supposed to go to in here, and I couldn't actually get it back together until I filed everything down. Now, other grinders don't really have that same issue. A lot of them actually have like an entire side or two sides of the axle slotted to avoid that. Now, some of that's on me because I put it together incorrectly one time and almost ruined the grinder. I've also tested dozens of hand grinders and never had that issue one time until I got to this particular design configuration. Also, with the way the burrs are designed, calibration is a little funny, because once you get down close to the 0 mark, I'm at like 0.5, you'll hear the burrs are actually starting to rub. And the way the burrs are designed, it's actually kind of supposed to do that. And they say the 0 point is right when the burrs can not really turn, but still kind of turn unless you're using excessive force. Now, number one, the actual definition of where that 0 point is going to vary for certain people. Now, one thing that I do like is calibration itself is pretty simple. You just take this thing off the adjustment ring, then you turn it around until your 0 is lined up with the red dot, and you can slip it back on and you've set a new 0 point. Super fast. The issue is sometimes I've accidentally kicked this calibration ring off as I've either been grinding or handling the grinder, and then I've lost what my calibration point actually was. So that one kind of goes both ways. Now, when it comes to espresso, they do give espresso range here on the side here. I tested this for espresso. Personally, I don't think I would recommend using it for that if that's your primary use case. I often will like to test with fairly light roast espressos just because it stresses the grinder a little bit more. It's a little bit harder. I was just under their recommended grind range for espresso, and I was finding it was taking like 60 to 70 seconds of pretty hard work to grind a shot of espresso. And not just that, but with where I had to grind to get a dialed in shot, it was in the zone where those burrs are rubbing together. And by the end of grinding my shot, down here where the burrs are was actually quite warm. Now, they actually say not to actually grind below the 2 setting because of that rubbing. I found to make espresso with the coffee that I was using, I actually needed to do that. And even at that point, you know, once I had the shot ground, I found adjusting by each tick could give me like 8 seconds difference in shot time on a flat profile machine. So, you know, not quite enough fidelity that I would normally look for an espresso grinder. So again, if that's your primary use case, I would probably put you in another direction. Now, to be fair to Mavo, there are actually very few grinders that I think are an excellent fit for espresso. As a filter grinder though, I do see the appeal. You know, it's not too expensive, coming in at about 150 bucks US. Do I think it is hyped? I think, yeah. This grinder probably is a little bit hyped right now. You know, people compare it to the ZP6, the K Ultra, the Comandante C40, and, you know, they're all a little bit different. That being said, when I put it up against those grinders, I have to say I did enjoy the cups out of them a little bit better than this. Even though they were a little different, they brought a little bit more intensity to the table. Compared to the Timemore S3, I can definitely see why you may want to choose a grinder like this over that. You know, it's got a very specific look. The presentation is very unique, definitely giving a lot of the time a more forgiving presentation overall. You know, for 150 bucks, this is definitely a competitive grinder. I think for most people, the differences between those higher end grinders are going to be pretty marginal. And I think at its price point, the value is absolutely there. Now, if you're into coffee, you love geeking out on this stuff, and you haven't yet subscribed to my channel, I would love for you to do that because I love making these videos and I'm always trying to unearth really cool stuff to review on here. But I would love to hear what you think about the Mavo Phantox Pro. Maybe you're an owner and you have some thoughts about this grinder. I would definitely be interested in that experience, and it's always helpful for other people watching too. Let me know your thoughts on this grinder in the comments. I hope your next cup of coffee is fantastic, and we'll see you next time.